Hey everybody, and welcome back to the channel. And if you're new, welcome to the channel. So today I'm gonna be working on the 1969 Dodge Charger, painted as the General Lee. And no, I'm not gonna slide across the hood. I don't think we'll be jumping the car today, but you never know. No, I'm just kidding. But what we're gonna do is fix the fan and replace this one with the new one, build a fan shroud for it. That way it drags more air across it and cools the engine down a lot more efficiently. And then we'll also clean up the MSD box and see where we can move it to make it more secure. And then also check and see why the brakes aren't working that great for having disc brakes all the way around on the car. I don't know what cam is in the motor, so it could be making not enough vacuum, which is causing it to be harder to stop the car. So check that out, and definitely check out the carburetor on it, because it doesn't run the way it should. So do that. And then on the interior of the car, what I have to do is pull the gate or the dash out and fix the fuel gauge, and also see why the speedo is making a bunch of noise. The speedo cable might need to be replaced. I have to look into that. And then, like I said, the fuel gauge on the car doesn't work, so check and see why that's not working. Get all that stuff fixed up, and then take it for a test drive and make sure everything's good to go before I deliver it back to the customer. I do know one thing this car is missing though. I got it right here in my hand, if I can pick it up. Is an old CB radio. Got one right here. And that way we can call in Uncle Jesse. Hey, Uncle Jesse, you out there? Just kidding. All right, enough fooling around. Let's get to taking this dash out. That way we can fix the fuel gauge and the speedo cable. So I'll set you guys up as a time lapse, and then I'll check and see if I can get to it either from the bottom, or if I have to, I will pull the gauge cluster itself. I just realized, which I should have known when I seen that, so I'm pretty sure that's a digital gauge. So that means there is no speedo cable. All right, for the fuel gauge, so what it was is I should have checked it before I decided to take the dash apart, even though I still have to look at the speedometer. But the sending unit is just unplugged. It wasn't plugged in enough, and I think what it is, it might be the housing is just too big. There's too much plastic, and I won't allow it to slide down onto the stud. So what I'm going to do is get underneath there and just trim some of it off, and then it should allow the stud, or the end of the sending unit for the fuel gauge, it should allow it to slide down on the stud, and then it'll make it work. Because right now it's working, but I don't want it to pop off while it's driving. So right now, if you could see it, it barely moves. So that means there's not a lot of fuel in the car, but it is working. So what I'm going to do is get underneath there, like I said, and just trim it, and that'll allow it to slide on there. And probably what I'll do is maybe I'll put some dielectric grease on there, that way it doesn't get any corrosion on it. So I'm going to slide back underneath the car and just grind it down a little bit, and then slide it on. All right, so I got the gauge cluster pulled out of the car. It's sitting over there on the stand. But yeah, just make sure, you know, when you take all this stuff apart, if you can get behind the dash before you unplug it, just make sure that you take some pictures. That way, if you didn't do the wiring, like on this thing, I didn't wire the dash. That way you can kind of have a reference of where everything plugs in, and you're not guessing, even though most of it is self-explained, but still, just want to make sure you they have pictures of all your wires. Just because there's like this brown wire and then another one right there, and then this brown and white one. So just make sure you get a picture that way. Like I said, you know, that way you don't screw up and accidentally wire it in wrong, and then you have to pull it back apart. But now what I have to do is unplug these wires right here, which I already have a picture of that, and then I'll slide the speedo gauge out and see if we can do something to make it quit squealing. And if not, then I'll just have to tell him, you know, that there is no speedometer, it's just the gauge cluster itself, and see what he wants to do from there. So let's see if I can break this thing down and pull it apart. All right, so I got the speedo out, and what I did is I had to use just a pair of these long needle nose pliers, and I didn't squeeze very tight. I just did enough pressure on it, that way I can push them up or pull them up, because it was too hard to try to do it by hand. So yeah, this thing's out, and there's a few screws. See if we can slide this thing apart, and then, like I said, see if we can fix it from squealing. I tried to see if I could take it apart, but since this ring is crimped around it, you can't pull it apart and get in there. So I don't want to really attempt it any farther, because I don't want to break it. So I'm just gonna give him a call and tell him what's going on with that. But it's too bad, because I don't know how much these things are, and it's in really good shape. I mean, so let's put it back in the car, wire everything back up, and throw the dash back in. All right, so I got the speedometer back in the gauge cluster, and let's get this thing thrown back in the car. It's unfortunate that I couldn't get it taken apart and maybe try to clean it, but that's all right for now. Let's get this thing thrown back in the car, and then we'll go from there. All right, here comes the fun part, getting it back in. So yeah, there we go. The dash is back in. I just got to put the bezel back in for the radio, bolt it back down or screw it back down, and then it'll be on to working on some of the engine. All right, so now let's move on to the MSD box. I already unplugged it and it's sitting over there. So what I think I'm gonna do, just so it's more secure instead of sitting on the inner fender like that, or the apron I should say, I think what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna put it down right here, and then I'll move this fuel filter and the fuel lines over, kind of out of the way, and then I'll make sure that they're not gonna, you know, get into the belts or anything like that. So what I'm gonna do now is just trim the rest of these zip ties that are holding all the wires together, and then undo the power supply, and then I'll lay the harness over on that side, and I'll have to go around the back, you know, of the engine, and then come over to this side, and I'll just clean it up, and I'll run some wire loom on it. That way it doesn't look so. Got my supervisor over here making sure I do all my work correctly and up to snuff. What I'm gonna do is I just kind of put one screw in. There was a hole already there for the MSD, so I'm gonna set it like this, and then I move the fuel filter and fuel lines on the frame rail, and it'll keep it out of the way from the pulleys and stuff, and it'll sit right above the alternator. I just have to trim this bracket a tiny little bit. That way it'll fit better on that frame rail. So now I just gotta add some wire to the MSD box harness just for the power supply, and then the other two leads that come off right there, and then we'll plug it back in, and that'll be all cleaned up, and then I will loom it just so it looks a lot better, because right now it kind of looks like the, you know. So let's get back to it. So I got all my wires ready. So since the ones that I unplugged over there were blue and yellow, I just made them the same color as that little power strip right there. And they'll hook into the gray and red wire, and then I have my power supply, which I'll run over there to that stud, and then the ground, I should be able to just put a body ground like how this is grounded right here. So now I just have to solder everything together, and then I'll be ready to get put in a loom and then run back over there, and then I'll tighten all this down and trim the little bracket that I was talking about, and this whole wiring harness for the MSD box will be completely done. Alright, so I got it kind of where I want. I think I'm going to move it a little more just because the way it comes up onto this stud right here, and then these two for the 2 wires to the MSD box besides the power supply. So I think I'm going to do is try to see where I can get it behind maybe the battery box. That way it just comes up a little bit cleaner. Gotta change batteries though. GoPro's gonna die. Man. Alright, so now the only thing I gotta do is trim these wires right here. I'm gonna add the 2 little eyelets. That way I can just undo these, screw them on, and then same with this one for the stud. Alright, so everything's buttoned up on the MSD. It's all wired in. Just gotta cut that down like I said earlier. And let's start this thing up, make sure everything's good. I put the battery back in. It already looks a little better right here. Next thing I gotta do is just clean up that wiring right there and put it in the loom. But yeah, let's see if the car will fire up. It should. It's always good to double check. Yeah, she definitely needs to be adjusted. Yeah, she needs a little bit of carburetor adjustment. If you guys like today's video on the General Lee, hit that like and subscribe button, also the notification bell, that way you guys can stay notified on the next video that'll be coming out with this car when we finally get to take her for a test drive. But I have to finish with a few things before we can do that. So make sure you guys are subscribed, and until next time, later.